want to make sure we cover before the rest of you take your test tomorrow, because we didn't really do very much with this in class, is the differences between classical art and Hellenistic art. Between, for example, what was being produced in the Golden Age of Greece or Golden Age of Athens, and what happened after you have the conquests by Alexander the Great. So we'll start with classical because it's older. And there are some very striking differences here that I want to point out to you. This sculptural frieze is called Mourning Athena. She's sad. They've suffered defeat. Okay, it's a beautiful sculpture. Now, some typical classical elements that you see in this. Okay, if we're talking about characteristics of classical art. For one thing, it's a very static image. She's not doing anything but standing there. Okay? We don't see a lot of movement, in other words, in classical art. You could call them still poses most of the time. Because she's there, you know. She's sad. She's not jumping around. All right. The next thing that we see is very idealistic images, very idealized views of the body. If it's ideal, then that means it's not real. You see lots of Greek gods and goddesses that are like superhuman. You see athletes with muscles that are not achievable. You don't see wrinkles. You don't see people who look old. You don't see a lot of emotion. It's beautiful. There's a lot of artistry that goes into this, but those are not qualities that we see with classical art. Okay? So they tend to be very much idealized. You have the perfect body. You have the perfect athlete. Which is something that the Greeks were supposed to be forever striving for. Very typical. Another characteristic, and you see this a lot with not just the sculpture, but in the architecture as well, symmetry. Now, with this pose, we don't really see that because she's slightly turned to the side, but we do have these very orderly lines down her clothing with the way you see the ripples coming down. It's very balanced. It's very well proportioned.
I would go so far as to say I would bet you that the proportions of that sculpture are mathematically perfect.
Well, and that's something else that the Greeks were really striving for. Balance, proportion, symmetry, order. Idealized images, not a whole lot of movement. Now, none of that is to disparage the qualities of the art, because it's still very beautiful, but that's just what it looks like. Let me show you another very famous image. Now, this is a discus thrower. And you think, well, you just said that they're not really moving a lot. Neither is this guy. Okay? It looks very posed. Okay, you've got both arms very straight. You've got these ridiculous muscle lines. Look at this V here and this crease right down his chest. And you could count every single one of his ribs.
The saddle over his thigh. No one has a muscle on the side of their hip like that.
Goes all the way down here. And again, does this look like a real person? This is somebody who is supposed to be the ideal athlete. This is not a physique that was achievable in ancient Greece. And again, you can tell he's very young. He's supposed to be in the prime of life. All right? Those are all qualities that we see with classical art. We associate classical art with Greek marble statues, plain white marble statues. They were actually painted, but, that's kind of worn off now. All right. To move from classical art to Hellenistic art, we're going to get a very different picture. Now, talking about the athlete. This statue does not look like the discus thrower. This is a Greek boxer. Now, with the image? Okay. All right, with Hellenistic art, you get a whole different batch of characteristics. There's a lot going on here. Now, for one thing, he ain't perfect. This looks a lot more like a real person. Much more realistic. Now, his face is very expressive.
His nose has been broken.
His nose is broken probably a few times. So you have a lot more emotion. And he's not symmetrical. You look at him, he looks old. He's got wrinkles in his face. His shoulders are slumped. Maybe this is a guy who's at the end of his career. Maybe he's walking into his last fight and he thinks he's going to lose. You can read a lot of stuff into that expression and into his body language. We didn't get that from the discus thrower. Okay? Hellenistic art, more real, more emotion, and they also tend to be more dynamic. And you don't see the dynamic characteristic or the implied movement with this one, but you definitely will in the next one. Now, this is Winged Victory, or it's also called the Nike of Samothrace. This is actually in Paris at the Louvre. Very famous. Probably used to have a head on it that somebody cut off and sold as a separate piece of sculpture because people did that. All right, now how is this different from the Athena, for example? For one thing, you can tell that this is a body moving forward. The wings are stretched back. They are distended. There's some tension in the muscles, like maybe this figure is getting ready to take off. You have the right foot forward. The weight is on the hip. You have the clothing being pulled back in here, where it looks like the wind is coming toward the front of the body. And the same thing here. We have this billowing kind of blousy thing happening with the clothes. This is a front view of the same statue. And again, it's not symmetrical. It's not supposed to be. You have these very sensual lines down the body where you can tell that it's draped. It's very thin. You can see the line of the leg, the knee, the thigh, the shape of the torso. And again, the hips are off kilter because there's one foot forward, and that's what happens to the body. And here you can also see the tension in the wings where it looks like they're being pulled back. That's how you can tell this is Hellenistic and not classical.